Great job, everybody. Just before we finish out this week, I want to make sure and recap a few things and look at three important narratives that we saw that led to both colonial conflict and paved the way to the Revolutionary War. So three of the big themes we saw was war and frontier violence and economic pressures. And if we look at war and frontier violence together, that we can focus in on that Ohio River Valley and the competition there between European powers. So if you go back and you see that tobacco prices that remain stagnant with the plantations in Virginia, it caused the plantation owners to look west, to look into the Ohio River Valley to produce more tobacco. And hopefully with the triangle trade, by raising more crops, being able to have more supply to then raise prices and have more control of prices. So looking to Ohio River Valley was really important for the plantation owners and for people throughout the British colonies to look westward for expansion. But at the same time, France was looking east. The French territory was looking into the disputed region of the Ohio River Valley and bringing in forts and a presence there to have control, political control, and safety for their fur trading and power structures that they were trying to establish as well. So this conflict led to, eventually would be the ignition to the 7 Years' War. Now, the other side of that, an important part, is the cooperation with Native Americans, and in fact, their powerful struggle in this region as well. So both the French and British forces had to cooperate with Native Americans to use their power in the 7 Years' War. The French allied with the Hurons and the British allied with the Iroquois and other tribes, but it's their interaction and the tensions in the war and after the war. Remember Pontiac's rebellion and other power structures that weren't at the negotiation table at the Treaty of Paris, but they made sure that they had their voice heard. And it was listened to, which eventually led to the proclamation of 1763. And so we have that important part as well. Now, the migration after the war, when the 7 Years' War ended and British won all of France's land holdings in colonial America, colonists wanted to expand westward again, right? But the fear of conflicts with Native Americans, British passed with the Proclamation Act of 1763, which prohibited the movement west of the Appalachian Mountains, and this greatly upset the colonists who wanted the land to increase their wealth, to expand their territory. And if we go back and think about the Enlightenment ideals, they believed it was their God-given right. They believed it was their values, their independence of life, liberty, pursuit of property, pursuit of happiness, all these different pursuits was their right. And it was stopped with the proclamation line, put up a wall that they couldn't pass. And that was a huge thing that upset the colonial men, women, everybody in the region that was looking to expand territory west. So thousands of colonists defied the law, continued to try to push west to claim land for themselves. So the last part that we want to really focus on or remember is the economic strains that the British government faced after the 7 Years' War. And those pressures led to taxes of the colonial people. They looked for them, for one, because it was their war, largely. This was happening in their territory, and it was preserving their area, their land, and it expanded their land, so therefore they should pay for it. But also with laws and pressures within England, they couldn't do taxes with the British people in England like they could with the colonial people afar. So colonial power allowed them to do things that they couldn't necessarily do on English soil in England. So that led to certain taxes and certain repercussions, especially in Boston. We saw how Boston was a radical place for things to ignite. And the Boston Tea Party, which involved the willful destruction of 342 crates of British tea and proved a significant development on the path to the Revolutionary War. We also saw that they dressed up as Indians, and it's often been described that they did that to put blame towards Native Americans, so it was kind of a disguise. But if we look a little deeper, these people that dressed up, they saw themselves as British first and foremost, and that's important. But also they saw themselves as quintessentially at the foundation of their soul being also American. And they didn't have an American flag or any other symbol to represent their Americanness other than those that were the most American, and they knew it, the Native Americans. So images both in comics of the time and political satire and in their action of dumping the tea, dressing up as a Native American, proved and showed that this was an American act. This was an American act, and it was a dialogue to explain and to create change. The idea was to make sure that the British government was hearing their colonial subjects, their citizens, their British citizens, to be able to uphold their personal rights. And this should all be language we can understand because we've looked at how the Enlightenment plays a major role. The ideas of the Enlightenment, of citizenship, sovereignty, and rights and personal rights. And as a British American, they felt that they needed this to be upheld. As the dumping of we talked about how the reaction, the intolerable acts as Americans were going to call it, quickly created more tension and more strain and was trying to isolate Boston from the rest of the colonies, but it did the exact opposite. It aligned the colonies together. It formed the First Continental Congress to discuss ways to negotiate a united front to the British government to make lasting change. There was the idea to negotiate with their government structures in place to say, we're British, we're American, and you are breaking the laws. You're breaking our rights. These are our rights. We need representation, our representation. Remember, no taxation without representation. They're talking about our representation as Americans with our government, the British government. And as that radical movement started to grow further and patriots started to break away from their identity as British and align fully with the fact that they're American, that started to take root and spread. And by the time of the Declaration of Independence, that was a huge transformation. Because now people's own identities, their personal identities, have changed and broke away from the British to be fully American. So I like to say, and I mentioned it before, that if you had a bumper sticker on a big pickup truck of this time period, of course they didn't have trucks in the 1700s, but if they did, with a big flag, you could put the Gadsden flag or whatever one they wanted, and it would have said, proud to be a British American. And we mentioned how Paul Revere, if he was going down the street saying the British are coming, everyone would think he was a crazy man because they would have said, yeah, we're here. The British are here. We are British. And that was before the Revolutionary War. That was before the Declaration of Independence. What happened with the Declaration of Independence, it switched that identity that we are British to say that we are American. And that is a huge thing for if we're Americans today to understand that shift. And this is where it began. This is where the birth came. And this is where individual identities took a new shape, a new shift that took time for it to build and to create of what we are and who we are today.